In this video, I want to talk a little bit about global distributive justice. If we were to give a fair survey of global distributive justice, this video would probably be hours long. So I'm going to try to limit my remarks to literature arising from Rawls's theory of justice and how it might be thought to require global redistribution of wealth and income to satisfy some kind of global difference principle, as well as efforts to make sure that each individual on the planet would be entitled to an equally valuable scheme of basic individual liberties. Now, the view just sketched out here seems wildly ambitious, and it's not Rawls's, but one of Rawls's students, Charles Bates, does make the case for precisely such a view. So what's the debate? First, let's have a look at Rawls's view. Rawls said that the original position was intended to apply to societies conceived of as essentially closed. For Rawls, questions of distributive and social justice apply to the basic structure of a society. This structure is also defined as a self-contained arena of social cooperation for mutual advantage. Where there is social cooperation, and the life chances of individuals depends on everyone abiding by the same laws, you can apply a criteria of social justice. On the other hand, where there is no social cooperation, there is no grounds for applying principles of social justice. For example, a tribesman from Papua New Guinea and an auto worker from Detroit are simply not engaged in social cooperation with one another. They are not part of a common framework of laws and social institutions that distribute burdens and benefits. And so for Rawls, social justice really does not apply between these two individuals. For Rawls, the case for redistribution of wealth across national boundaries fails most notably because redistributive claims are a kind of claim that depends on individuals sharing a coercive set of institutions that regulate burdens and benefits. Redistribution is in particular necessary to compensate for the coercive enforcement of certain kinds of property regimes. Okay, so what did Rawls think about global justice? Rawls thought that the main actors in international society were states, and that in an original position, these states would largely agree on norms of state sovereignty and conflict limitation, rules that are very much in line with what Kant would have outlined 200 years earlier. Now, Rawls's view was pretty disappointing to many liberals who admired Rawls's view but thought that global inequalities and global suffering were morally unacceptable, and that making the state the unit of analysis in the global original position was unacceptably deferential to existing national boundaries. These existing national boundaries were the product of many morally arbitrary historical processes like colonialism, and as such were not fit to be respected the way individual persons were meant to be respected. One of the first to try and reinterpret justice as fairness for the international arena was Charles Bates. Bates argued that Rawls had overlooked at least two key problems. The first problem is that it's not just states who engage in social cooperation internationally. Individuals and corporations are already, and Bates is writing in the late 1970s, already trading, employing each other, and doing most of the things that count as social cooperation for mutual advantage. When a college professor in Tennessee buys Exxon Mobil stock, and Exxon invests in offshore drilling in Papua New Guinea, which lures young Guinean villagers away from farming towards construction of new facilities and in search of higher wages near those offshore oil rigs, the American college professor and the Guinean farmer, whose laborers are being taken away from him by the higher wages offered by Exxon, are in some ways sharing the benefits and burdens of social cooperation, enough Bates thinks that so that some principles of justice ought to regulate this kind of interdependence. The alternative to coming up with principles of justice to regulate these kinds of situations is to leave it up to the market, or leave it up to ExxonMobil executives, or some other non-moral criteria for deciding whether the burdens and benefits that each party faces is just, and that's just not acceptable. A second point that Rawls overlooked is that the world of states is riddled with moral arbitrariness, especially in the distribution of natural resources and economic advantage. Rawls Bites thinks is allowing these morally arbitrary things, and hence morally irrelevant things, to affect the choice of principles for the international arena. No one deserves being born near or far from natural resources or in a historically advantaged versus disadvantaged society. Therefore, no one's chances in life on this planet should be better or worse simply because they happen to be born on one side of a border or another. This is a point that Joe Cairns makes even more forcefully than Bites. In other words, if Rawls was serious about eliminating morally arbitrary sources of inequality, as he is domestically, then he ought to have said something different about global justice, rather than just leaving it up to states. The consequences for Bites are clear. Resources and income need to be transferred across borders in such a way as to equalize the value of the liberties of individuals anywhere across the globe. Now, Joe Cairns, if I can get the slide up, there we go. Joe Cairns might add that since borders are doing much of the coercing, these kinds of transfers that Bites envisages could be seen as compensation that rich countries owe poor countries as a result of their failure to allow the poor to immigrate to their countries. Of course, the cheaper way of fulfilling these duties is to stop coercing people into staying in their countries and allowing them to immigrate. But the bottom line for Rawls's critics is that domestic property regimes and borders must be justifiable to those who are coercively excluded from their benefits or coercively burdened by them. The international legal, political, and economic order is in fact a coercive structure that requires justification, and so Rawls may have been a bit too hasty to deny claims of global justice. Now, I think this kind of conclusion may seem counterintuitive to most of us, because most of us feel sympathy, but few of us feel duties to those who live far away and live under less fortunate circumstances than we do. Certainly, we have a hard time seeing why we should sacrifice our hard-earned income for the benefit of people who are so different from us that if we met them, we could scarcely understand what they were saying or what they were trying to communicate to us. I think perhaps there's another answer, though, than the one that is presented to us by Cairns and Bites. Bites and Cairns think that we are unjustly and jealously guarding advantages for ourselves that we should really redistribute to the less fortunate. So we are profiting undeservedly from natural resources and historical circumstances that we did nothing to bring about. And therefore, as a result of our profiting, other people are being excluded and harmed. Cairns think that we are unjustly and jealously guarding advantages for ourselves. But let's remember that for Rawls, social cooperation is at its base mutually beneficial. It's mutually beneficial because it, in some sense, enables us to take advantage of one another's natural talents. Think about it this way. How many Einsteins, Edisons, or Pasteurs have we lost because instead of being born in the West, they were born somewhere in the global South, maybe India, maybe China, maybe the Congo, and therefore unable to make much of their talents as they were crippled by sickness or hunger or illiteracy? How many great doctors, teachers, and engineers failed to appear because there was no education or no basic physical security under which they could develop their talents? How much better off would we be today if those talents had been brought to market for the benefit of the entire human race? So perhaps investing in basic liberties and primary goods for people in Asia and Africa doesn't really make us poorer, but instead, over the long run, avoiding such investments out of misplaced selfishness, that's what makes us poor. In other words, if we were truly self-interested, and by that I mean if we were really selfish, we would develop a global framework of cooperation that enables us to profit from the talents and ingenuities of distant people, living as they do on $1 a day, subsistence farming, or otherwise local economic production. That kind of life benefits us not at all, if you think about it. So making sure that individuals have the same basic liberties that we do, the same opportunities to develop their conceptions of the good life and to develop their talents for the common good, actually is much more likely to make us better off than worse off. Because after all, having neighbors with higher incomes who produce better goods and services for us doesn't take away anything from us, it makes us better off. Whether those neighbors are in Cincinnati or Mumbai, India, probably doesn't make much of a difference. Bytes and Karens tend to focus on the redistributive component of Rawls's view. But in order for distribution to take place, we have to remember there must first be cooperation and production. You might say that Karens and Bytes seem to think that the major problem with the world is that resources and wealth is badly distributed. But you could also look at it in a different way, which is to say that the major problem facing the world today is that many talents are not being used to a common advantage. That, in other words, there is insufficient cooperation, and therefore we are all worse off than we otherwise might be. A global application of justice as fairness might first require freer trade, freer immigration, and productivity-enhancing transfers, not simply sending checks south of the border.